Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude. China continues to work against India on many issues in the geopolitical arena, most recently by ganging up with Pakistan to try and stall India's efforts to enter the nuclear supplier group, where India is going to be supported extensively by US and its friends. Earlier, China had blocked India's efforts to get the United Nations to declare Masood Azhar, the man India blames for the attacks on Pathankot, a terrorist. These are points that would have certainly been driven home by the President of India on his recent visit to Beijing.
The recent visit by India's President Pranab Mukherjee to China followed up on a string of ministerial visits to Beijing and was not only to convey that New Delhi wishes to enhance bilateral ties but also India's unhappiness at Beijing's efforts to keep India boxed within the subcontinent and limit New Delhi's growing influence by open Chinese support for Pakistan's anti-Indian agenda. This has now become increasingly evident with Beijing first blocking India's efforts to get the UN to censure Masood Azhar for acts of terrorism, and now in its attempts to club India with Pakistan to deny India the membership of the NSG, the 48-nation nuclear suppliers group, by citing New Delhi's resistance to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of the NPT. The 48-nation nuclear suppliers group pursues by consensus its guidelines against nuclear proliferation concerned by monitoring globally. 1. The status of nuclear material. 2. Nuclear reactors and equipment. Therefore, 3. Non-nuclear material for reactors. 4. Plant and equipment for the reprocessing, enrichment and conversion of nuclear material and for fuel fabrication and heavy water production. And 5. Technology associated with each of the above items. The second set of NSG guidelines governs the export of nuclear-related dual-use items and technologies, which could make a significant contribution to an unsafeguarded nuclear fuel cycle or nuclear explosive activity. China's efforts to block India's entry into the NSG unless Pakistan too is taken in will in all likelihood be challenged by the US and its allies, as Washington has chosen to only support India's entry into the NSG and not that of Pakistan. As of now, China's double standards and moral ground standing has few takers either in the NSG or the NPT. Since Beijing had itself opposed the NPT as discriminatory for years before joining up, and then in an open contravention to its international commitments at the NPT, China has helped Pakistan's nuclear ambitions just like it has done with North Korea.
While Pakistan continues to occupy much more media space in India, and many in India think Pakistan is a constant threat to India, a bigger threat looms north of India from China. China is a country that India needs to understand better, and its intentions and its designs. And to understand how China thinks and operates, we have two eminent experts, former Indian diplomats, Mr. Shashank, who was India's foreign secretary and has had a lot of experience in looking at issues related with China, and has also served as an Indian diplomat in Pakistan. And we have Mr. Chandrasekhar Dasgupta, former Indian ambassador to Beijing and an author of a rather well-researched work on Kashmir and India-Pakistan relations. Foreign Secretary, sir, China has been continuing to block Indian efforts to enter the international arena, most recently by its desire to prop up Pakistan as a counter to India at the NSG, when America and many members of the NSG are very clear of the view that India meets virtually all the requirements of NSG membership, with the exception of the fact that it is not an NPT signatory. So, what is the Indian reluctance to sign the NPT now that we've gone nuclear, and how would we benefit from NSG membership?
Well, firstly, NPT was negotiated at a time when China had already exploded its bomb and India was a little away from that. So China was in and India was out. And China has tried to play on that all the time. And it was the heavy lifting done by the US President Bush that he kind of persuaded China to support India's nuclear status as a nuclear weapon power and also to carry on with the IAEA procedures without any additional safeguards. Now, what has happened is that China is continuing on the score that yes, Pakistan should get the same facilities what India has got. China knows very well that if India's record has been a unique record in the annals of science and technology in the atomic era, Pakistan's is totally to the contrary, that they have been acting like a Walmart, supplying all kinds of technology, designs, etc. to all other countries. But that debate, because there is no Supreme Court as such at the Security Council or at the international level, China looks at its own interests. So long as China was feeling that yes, they could move together with India and Russia in the process of whether RIC, Russia, India, China dialogue, or within the various Asian forums, they were quite willing to move along on that system, that India should get an additional leverage in the international forums because that will be good for China. However, what has happened is that lately, India has been emphasizing much more on a joint vision towards Asia Pacific, especially including the area of South China Sea. So China has started looking more and more towards India as a proxy for the Western powers, especially the United States. And that is what they are telling their Russian friends also. They are being persuaded by Pakistan that they are quite right in that kind of an analysis. And that is, I think, what is leading to this difficulty, that they want to somehow equate Pakistan with India, knowing it very well that our records are totally different. And China always said that India is in a completely different league than Pakistan. And that is how the India-China trade relations have moved up so much to such a high level.
Very well brought out, sir. Taking off from where the former Foreign Secretary has left us, I want to bring out 2 points. We, despite our disadvantages, have allowed China to trade across the board in India, and they have a 2/3 advantage over us on trade vis-a-vis them. Your experience with China, what is it that drives Chinese sentiment against India? Is it a desire to curtail India and limit it and box it to the subcontinent, as Martin Jacques puts it in his book, When China Rules the World? Or is it a desire purely to use India to its advantages, both in trade and other issues, without seeing India eventually as a threat to the Chinese? How do the Chinese think?
I don't think the Chinese look at India as a threat or even a rival, but it does view India as a rising power which poses a potential challenge. Today, it regards China's position as far higher than India in terms of economic power, in terms of military power, comprehensive power, as the Chinese put it. But they recognize that the Indian economy is doing very well, that India is a large country with a huge potential, and therefore the future could be different from what it is today. Now, having said that, in international questions generally, in UN questions, the Chinese position depends on this distinction. Where China sits at the high table, for example, in the UN Security Council or in the Nuclear Suppliers Group, it sees no particular reason why it should favor India's candidature for a seat at the same table. Now, this doesn't mean that it will always oppose us. It's a question of calculation of costs and benefits. So if they think that they'll be isolated and will have to pay a heavy diplomatic price, they will finally give in. For example, in Vienna, when the Indo-US nuclear deal was negotiated, and they saw that they were left in a minority of one, and then they acceded. Now, there are other issues where China does not currently, as yet, sit on the high table. Matters of finance. China has a very powerful financial player, but in terms of voting rights at the IMF, it still has a considerable way to go. Questions of international environmental negotiations, such as climate change, certain trade questions, China is still not sitting at the high table, and here it perceives a commonality of interests with India. And indeed, there is a coincidence of interests. As China gets co-opted to the high table, you will find this area where our interests coincide, narrowing in the international sphere. And whether we get a place ourselves at the high table will depend on how well we are doing.
Right. Sir, coming back to you, and you talked about, and I want a short answer to this, that how Pakistan continues to be a proliferator. There is evidence that A.Q. Khan was running a black market. By his own admission, which came out in the public domain some years ago, that he'd received centrifuges from China. Some say Pakistan's nuclear program is China's nuclear program in Pakistan. So how can China pontificate by telling us that we don't adhere to the NPT, so we have no reason to get into the NSG because all NSG members are NPT adherents? But there's another reality that all NSG members, bulk of them, are not capable really of producing nuclear weapon systems.
No, factually, firstly, France was a member of the NSG before signing the NPT for a few months. Later on, they had signed the NPT. The other issue is that it's really the Pakistani arguments which the Chinese have just picked up, and they are using them, saying that some countries feel like this, but actually it is only one country which is telling the Chinese, and Chinese are not using their mind. China and India have so many more things in common, and if the Chinese want to do certain things, they want cheap labor or they want some connectivity, etc., for their commercial considerations in Pakistan, in Gwadar, etc. So that is all right, because perhaps Pakistan would become more of a normal country with the Chinese putting in so much of money, $46 billion in Pakistan's economy. So they cannot allow Pakistan to become totally abnormal, to go under the control of the terrorists. So therefore, China has to understand, and I'm quite sure that China knows it, but we have to carry on a dialogue with China all the time, and I'm very glad that the president has been there, and the other communications at other high levels have been going on with the Chinese.
Right. Interesting points. We'll be back after a break to look at what all India can do to counter China's efforts to prop up Pakistan, and how India should brace itself for the joint China-Pak onslaught diplomatically in the near future. Welcome back. We still have our two distinguished guests with us. Mr. Dasgupta, sir, China, of course, is been ganging up with Pakistan for a long time. And the relationship actually goes back to decades when the Chinese had decided to extend nuclear support to Pakistan, which eventually led to Pakistan making its nuclear program. But more recently, China has taken a more difficult approach to issues where the world is generally all together, and China seems to be taking a moral high ground on issues like the UN resolution of 1267, under which countries should not subscribe to or support any terrorist or those with terrorist linkages. Now, we have the case earlier of Zikrur Rahman Lakhvi, who was declared a terrorist by the Americans. There's a bounty on his head, just like Hafiz Saeed. And now you have Masood Azhar, who was clearly behind the role in the attack on Pathankot. And India's efforts to try and get Masood Azhar, like Lakhvi, nailed by the UN has been blocked by China on technical grounds. Now, what technical grounds is China looking for?
Why are they looking for technical grounds in the first place? The thing is that the Chinese record on combating international terrorism is a very, very unimpressive one. At home, they crack down on terrorist activities. But when it comes to international terrorism, the Chinese tendency is to try and do a deal with the terrorist organization. Don't trouble us and we won't trouble you. This has been their attitude in regard to terrorist groups and to state sponsors of terrorism. Pakistan and Afghanistan when it had a Taliban government. These were the deals that were which were worked out. The CPC had invited groups like the JI and the JUI from Pakistan. The Communist Party of China had invited, these religious sort of extremist groups, and the reason was that don't give assistance to the Uyghurs. Make sure that Uyghur separatists do not have any facilities in Pakistan, and we will not get in your way. This was the basic of the deal which they negotiated. Now it's interesting to see that religious extremists in Pakistan really bring out demonstrations against things like the forced closure of mosques in Xinjiang, or the fact that imams in every mosque have to be approved by Communist Party officials, or the injunctions that nobody in government employ should observe Ramzan, etc.
So would it be fair? Would it be a fair assessment to say that the vast masses of mullah-led people seem to look at China differently than GHQ Rawalpindi does?
GHQ Rawalpindi looks at China as a friend, and these guys also, tend to look at China, if not as a friend, at least not as opponents. So they've done a deal that we won't get in your way, etc. Apart from this, of course, there's the close Sino-Pak relationship, which explains China's position. So it's these two factors. Firstly, the Chinese policies regarding international communism, the tendency to international terrorism, the tendency to strike deals with them, that you keep the Uyghurs out and we will not bother with you. And the second is the Sino-Pakistan factor. That explains the position that they took recently.
Mr. Foreign Secretary, sir, China has been arming Pakistan rather aggressively of late. China has become from one of the world's largest importer of weapon systems to one of the largest exporter of weapon systems, and its big market is Pakistan. Pakistan and China gives lectures to India in particular about the missile technology control regime. But then again, while our missiles are not really crossing over the limit imposed by MTCR, China has been supplying Pakistan indirectly missile systems through its other client, North Korea. So what was your assessment of China arming Pakistan when you were in South Bloc, both as Foreign Secretary and Secretary before that?
No, the point is that the Chinese are helping Pakistan to build up this thing, because Pakistan is a very special case. They have got weapon systems from the West, and also they get from China. They keep supplying information about the Chinese systems to the Western countries and the other way around. So it's a very useful relationship for all these countries. The West likes it, the Chinese like it very much. They know that these weapons are not going to be used at all, except either on the population of Pakistan or with India. And the Indians also, they appreciate that India, they would not be able to, of course, they can only mobilize to some extent to annoy India, but cannot go beyond a certain level. So therefore, I see it really in the context of the Chinese trying to become one of the major superpowers now that the Russians are no longer in that position. So they want to acquire as many concessions from the Americans to be considered as a superpower. So that is number one. Secondly, in the case of India, they have been trying to get closer to India in the South Asian region in order to limit the options for India and increase their own options. So they are trying to build up ports and roads and rail links in all the neighboring countries. In fact, several of them have been telling us that they are feeling very uncomfortable with these Chinese inroads, because India takes a few years, if not more, before they actually implement their infrastructure related projects or power projects, etc. Whereas in the case of China, it's only a matter of a few months by the time these things start implementing. So they have been telling us that India should study China much more closely and see that at least it comes up to certain kind of balance. And they are willing to offer us. Several Southeast Asian countries have told us that they feel totally threatened by the Chinese, but they cannot tell the Chinese. So therefore, they would like India to develop much closer relations with them to understand how the Chinese behave, to be able to somehow provide more balance, more equipoise in the Asian region. And therefore, India needs to work on that relationship and not just see on the basis that India has been cornered and India is under pressure. No, we have a lot of friends, and Chinese ultimately know the language of power. So we need to work on that.
Very important, very important. So quickly, a question to you and a short answer. China has invested in Pakistan in various areas, the latest being the $46 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor going right on to Gwadar, which is again a port which has serious strategic implications for us. So where do you see China's next set of initiatives and investments coming into Pakistan? Pakistan is a $250 billion economy on which $46 billion comes in from outside. Obviously, it causes concern in the world. So any more money likely to come into Pakistan, or even this $46 billion is basically a mirage?
It could well turn out to be a mirage. I have no doubt that China will pour in large sums of money into Pakistan, but 46 billion is an aspirational figure, and I'd be surprised if you actually see that amount of money coming in. Now, I hope one area where the Chinese do invest in Pakistan is in the power sector. The Pakistan government is keen on that, and if they're able to do something to help improve the Pakistan economy, I think it would be a good thing all around.
Yes, I think in the interest of India-Pakistan relations and in the interest of a more stable Pakistan, a good economic season for Pakistan would be welcomed by all of us. Due to constraints of time, sir, we need to wrap up the show, but I think there are 3 or 4 very important points that have emerged in this discussion. One is that China will continue to resist India's rise for a variety of reasons, because it still feels that it could use India to its benefit more than extracting benefits from India at this point of time. But equally important is that China's conditional support to issues related with terrorism, even though the global mood is against terrorists, is basically more focused on China's agenda and its own interest of doing deals with various countries and terrorist groups as long as China doesn't get harmed and harassed. But most importantly, as has been brought up in the show, that India needs to study China more, India needs to understand China more, because the Chinese mind works in a very, very different way as against the Anglo-Saxon mind that many of us are more used to dealing with and engaging. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us on the show. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, goodbye. Thank you.